Hi everyone, this is Trini Rowett from Allies in Color and the Center of Multicultural Political Engagement, Literacy and Leadership. Today we have two wonderful guests. We've got Dr. Fan Yang from the University of Melbourne, and we have Dr. Sukhmani Khorana from the University of New South Wales. Today we're going to do a presentation on migrants, their engagement and the Voice Referendum result, and also talk a little bit about the national survey that we have started sending out, and hopefully you've seen it, and the survey is on political and media literacy, and it's a national survey, national research, first of its kind to this extent. Before I dive right in, I'd first like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I am zooming in from. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have made an important contribution to this land and community and continue to do so. This land is, was, and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. So, who is Allies in Color and who are we? We are an independent national peak advocacy and research body for advancing culturally and racially marginalized Australians and their representation in positions of power and influence. And we've got three target areas, basically governance, politics, and entrepreneurship. Now, as part of our efforts to advance calm Australians in politics, we've got the Center of Multicultural Political Engagement, Literacy and Leadership. It's a mouthful. In short, it's COMPEL. I'm going to zoom through all of those guys because we've got a lot to cover. So briefly, we've done a lot of work this year as an organization. We have done a lot of advocacy and activism work. I won't dive into the details of that. We've done a lot of work in the space of the multicultural framework review in terms of engaging with migrant communities to make sure that they're all providing input into this very important piece of work. And COMPEL, as part of its mission, we collected data on the ethnic representation of the elected parliamentarians in the last federal election. And we have the data at the moment. We've got 8% ethnic representation in the lower house. COMPEL also launched its first ever pilot program, the Political Engagement Literacy and Public Office Leadership Program, in short, PELPOL, to provide civic education and political literacy education to migrants. And we also did a national tour of networking events to foster intercultural bonds and encourage political engagement amongst multicultural Australians. This is why we're doing this webinar today. Finally, together with Dr. Fan Yang and Dr. Sukhmani Khorana, we have commissioned a very important piece of research on the political and media literacy of Chinese and South Asian migrant communities in Australia. With that, I'm going to stop share. So, Dr. Fan, did you want to start with a brief introduction about yourself and your research and your interest in this space?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the introduction, Tarini. And hi, everyone. My name is Fan Yang. I'm a research fellow at Melbourne Law School, ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making Society. I study Chinese language media in Australia, digital technologies, and also migration politics. It's been a pleasure to work with the team to understand media consumption and political participation of Chinese migrants and South Asian communities here in Australia.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And Dr. Khorana?
So My name is Sukhmani Khorana. I'm an associate professor of media at the University of New South Wales. And I've been interested for a while in various dimensions of representation, which is primarily to do with how there's a lack of diversity in Australian media and also across the global north. And I'm interested in how to address it, not just in the media, but also across realms like politics and social movements. And in terms of people who represent the communities, but also in terms of mobilizing communities through affective and effective social movements. And this project is definitely a part of that broader endeavor. Back to you, Tarini.
Beautiful. We were going to go talk a little bit about the result of the Voice Referendum. And obviously, for a lot of people, that was not a desired result at all. And quite a lot of people were genuinely surprised by the unsuccessful referendum. So we'll start with you, Dr. Khorana. You sort of reside in the western part of Sydney, in the multicultural heartbeat, if I can say that, of Sydney, New South Wales. What was your observation and also your thoughts on why the referendum was unsuccessful?
Thank you for asking, Tarini. I, in some ways, dwell between spaces. I spend the most amount of time living in the inner West, and the inner West is obviously an area where you have a lot of people who are highly educated, who also largely voted yes, and where Anthony Albanese's seat, federal seat, is also located. I work at a university which is located in the eastern suburbs, which also largely voted yes. Yet I reside in the multicultural heartland of Sydney and of New South Wales, which is in Western Sydney. So I think I had exposure to, why there was a high degree of yes vote in certain parts of New South Wales, as well as why there was a no vote in some other parts. Now, it is important to remember that when you look at migrant communities or Western Sydney, for that matter, it's very important that we don't homogenize these communities. I was also part of a campaigning group called South Asians for Voice, which was largely a digital campaign to begin with, to have in-language support available to South Asian migrants in Australia through Facebook, primarily because we wanted to target older migrants. It was a deliberate strategy, and also through other means, which were mostly social media. But we were realizing towards the end of our campaign and towards the approach date of the referendum that we needed a grassroots campaign because there was a great deal of misinformation, both on social media and through mail-outs and flyers by the No campaign that was reaching the migrant communities, or in many of the Western Sydney seats, despite there being Labour MPs and people on the front bench in federal parliament, they weren't actively engaging with their communities in terms of making communities understand why the voice mattered and why they should vote yes, or why they should express solidarity with our Indigenous communities. So it was a very varied landscape between people being quite mobilized and energized, either because the grassroots campaign had reached them or because they felt some sort of empathy for Indigenous people because their own experience of colonization or dispossession or civil war. It was a case of a lot of people facing cost of living pressures and making decisions on the basis of that primarily. It was also a lot of misinformation, and even educated migrants in parts of Western Sydney believing the No campaign, that this was going to lead to increase in taxes, or even misinformation like it might lead to visas being cancelled. So I do think that the sitting parliamentarians, in addition to the yes campaigners, could have done a lot more engaged, tailored work in Western Sydney communities, in communities that didn't necessarily grow up with understanding First Nations history or contemporary issues. So that's primarily first generation migrants. Whereas I do think that primarily through my exposure to students both in Western Sydney and UNSW, that with the children of migrants, there is usually a very high degree of understanding and solidarity with First Nations issues. So I'll end my discussion of the referendum there, but I think overall it does lead to more questions than answers about how migrants vote, and not just in terms of which party they vote for, but also what motivates them, and what also increasingly what media sources they're using, because it seems like that's there isn't a connection being made between media consumption and political literacy, and that is a big chunk of the missing puzzle for us to understand these communities better.
Absolutely.
Back to you, Tarini.
Thank you, Sukhmani. And what about you, Fan? What were your thoughts and observations?
My involvement with the Voice Referendum is basically revolved around my research. I've been collating a project which we call Recapture since 2019. So what we have been doing is that from 2019, we started collecting and monitoring public posts from WeChat, and now we extend the project to Red, Xiaohongshu as well. So in this project, we predominantly focused on how China's migrant communities, China's social media discuss and engage with Australian politics, including, for example, significant political events, federal level and state level elections, issues of Australian-China relations, immigration policies, national economy, job market, and also climate change, etc. So we currently maintain the biggest database of WeChat public posts outside China. So from 2023, from February 2023, we started monitoring how the Voice Referendum has been discussed and has been covered by those public posts on WeChat, and what types of information were circulated, and what were the actors engaging this space, shaping this kind of discussions. And I do share some of the concerns that Sukhmani had just discussed in terms of disinformation, misinformation, and possibly right-wing politics, and some information that contain quite strong white supremacy ideologies as well. As information on WeChat has been, largely outside the scope of Australian regulation and also monitoring, our research team has been playing this kind of role to understand and analyze what's going on with China's migrant communities online, what they have been talking about, and what are their opinions, and what are the public sentiments towards this very significant and also historical event. During the campaign, we provided consultation with Australian national media outlets and also institutions as well. We have a policy brief, which is a work in process to be published next year. But based on our current analysis from February 2023 to the end of September 2023, we have identified that as we draw closer to the date of the Voice Referendum, this information came to dominate the online discourse. And overwhelmingly significant amount of online users expressed they're going to vote no. Compared to the scalable influence of disinformation campaign or vote no campaign circulated through both users' comments and also short video functions on WeChat and also Reddit, and yes campaign was far less effective compared to disinformation and vote no campaign. And many of those yes campaigns are actually conducted by Australian public NGOs and also Australian public institutions, including AEC. And some of the Australian politicians, they quite actively participated in yes campaign as well. But the effect and also the influence that we saw on WeChat and Red was very minimum.
So why was it that the efforts made by the yes campaigners was less effective?
Well, on the one hand, the yes campaign happened too late. Well, I'm not denying that yes campaign, we've seen political advertisement from Yes Alliance campaign, but that political advertisement was wrapped in the articles of WeChat official accounts of those public posts. Whereas if you look at those disinformation campaigns, many of those disinformation campaigns, they're circulated by short video functions. On the one hand, you have, political advertisement for yes campaign, but it's just like a tiny image banner within the article. On the other hand, you have disinformation vote no campaign, which gained like 30,000 repost or times of shares within 24 hours of launching the video.
Is it
And
because they're
also,
just they're playing on people's fears, so just having something which is more
exactly,
emotionally driven was what made it more effective?
that is another really good point, Sukhmani. And disinformation campaign or vote no campaign, they're designed, curated, and established based on migrant communities' existing anxiety and fear. They're afraid, they're worried about what's going to happen if Indigenous communities are recognized here in Australia. And there's the issues, there's some kind of fears, which Sukhmani just talked about, those kind of concerns around the rising taxation based on the cost of ALPs, leftist politics, racial divide, and the prevalence of conspiracy theories, and also, you know, white supremacy ideologies as well.
Right, that's very interesting. And WeChat is something that I've only recently, not too long ago, started to look into. And I have to say, if I were to compare that with the likes of Facebook, as in terms of a platform for engagement, WeChat is quite powerful. And I can only imagine, you know, if you were to produce short, sharp, emotional videos, how effective they would have been versus an article that you'd have to actually read. That totally, you know, makes sense, having looked at and used WeChat functionality myself. Back to you, Sukhmani. You said that did you say that a lot of there were Labour Party politicians who didn't really campaign in the western suburbs as much as they should have for the Yes campaign?
Look, this is just based on, you know, being a resident and someone who was involved in the campaign, first through the digital media, and then also briefly in terms of on the ground campaigning in suburbs like Pendle Hill, which has a high number of South Asian residents. I think we were campaigning a week before the referendum, the Saturday, the 7th of October, I think. And Durga Owen, who's a long-time Labour member and was a possibility for being the Labour candidate in the seat of Parramatta in the last federal election, until Andrew Charlton, the high-profile celebrity candidate, was parachuted in. And I have heard of, you know, forums where Andrew Charlton was present and other Labour MPs who are from Western Sydney or Southwestern Sydney were present, and they were engaging on the issues. So I'm not saying that they haven't engaged with the issue or held community forums, but the grassroots campaigning is what I saw Durga being involved with, where she was literally walking into every single business on the main high street in Pendle Hill, which has a high population of Tamil and Sri Lankan small businesses, and having a conversation with them along with other groups like Tamils for Yes and South Asians for Yes. And most of those businesses were persuaded to have a Yes poster outside in an area like Western Sydney, where it isn't entirely without, you know, it's not something that you can do without any fear of repercussions, you know, putting a Yes poster outside your small business. So I do think this reflects a greater problem in our federal politics and to some extent state politics as well, although I think New South Wales has a better representation of ethnic diversity in our state parliament now. But I do think it reflects this problem of the people who are good grassroots campaigners, who have lived experience in an area, who should have been involved in the official campaign, weren't. I think if someone like Durga was given ample resources as a Labour MP, or, you know, that would have been a much more effective way of mobilizing those communities than just a bunch of volunteers, you know, volunteering their time without any kind of, you know, organization around us, or, you know, massive campaigning resources behind us. So there was a lot of goodwill in some migrant communities, is what I'm trying to suggest, a lot of goodwill. And they even, you know, many of the South Asian communities, for instance, they even managed to think about, the kind of solidarity they had with the First Nations and not think about the differences they had with each other. So whether it was Desis for yes, or Tamils for yes, or Punjabis for yes, they were all willing to work together and forget about their intra-ethnic differences. And I think that was a real moment of, how these communities can be mobilized in the Australian political contemporary moment, and something that I guess we will continue to build on in future political events of this kind. But it does also point to the problem of this is working at a grassroots level, but could have been more effective if there was more top-down machinery and resources behind it.
Absolutely, 100%. And this is what we've observed as an organization. There were a lot of community forums being held rather than the sort of the door knock style campaigning that you should be doing, and you would do if you were to treat it as seriously as you would an election campaign. Political parties are not averse to door knocking and meeting people and go walking into businesses and trying to get their support. But I didn't really observe much of that happening. I've heard that perhaps the Teals did a pretty good job at campaigning because they had a lot of resources at hand, volunteer based especially. But what was interesting, and I think there's been a lot of talk about demographic data and whether education played a part, and religion, or what. There were a lot of information. There's a lot of information on that sort of data, but what has not been provided is campaign expenditure. How much of the Yes campaign was actually spent in those suburbs or in those outer metro areas where the no votes were quite high versus the inner metro areas. We don't actually have data or information, publicly available information on that, because if they hadn't spent money campaigning, then you would only assume that the awareness wouldn't be there and the motivation to vote yes wouldn't be there. And a simple video, convincing video telling people to vote no would have done the trick, because if you don't know, vote no is quite catchy and it's easy to understand. There's nothing to explain. One other observation that Allies in Colour made as well, it's really a big one, is the level of education required to teach people, and it's not a migrant issue, it's an Australian issue, to explain to people why we needed the referendum. A lot of people actually didn't understand. They didn't even understand the historical significance of why we needed the referendum and the Indigenous history. It's not something that is really being taught. And if you're a newly arrived migrant who hasn't necessarily attended school here, you wouldn't have had that anywhere to get that sort of knowledge. You'd have to be self-motivated to go and read up on the Indigenous history to do that, and most people don't have the time. And so Allies in Colour, we produced a video on that before the referendum, but obviously it wasn't enough. So I'm grateful for your observations, for both your observations. And that nicely brings us to why we need this national survey on political literacy and media literacy, because a lot of the times when we talk about migrants and their influences and what's making them vote a certain way, we talk about it in a very uninformed manner and without a fundamental evidence to base our opinions on. A lot of what is available publicly tends to be opinions and whatever that has been inferred from demographic data, and that's not sufficient. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen back again. And so, yes, together with UNSW, Dr. Sukhmani Khorana, and University of Melbourne, Fan Young from University of Melbourne, we are doing this national research, very important piece of research, because that will help us talk about migrant engagement issues in a more informed manner. That's us. And Dr. Sukhmani, do you want to talk a little bit more about the aims of this research?
I think I'm probably one of those people who, along with Fan and others, is asked at every federal election, at least the last 2 federal elections, and sometimes state elections as well, about how a certain migrant community is going to vote. And there's a little bit of academic work on this in primarily in politics and political sociology, and it tends to suggest that migrants don't vote on the basis of whether they're from a certain ethnic community. There's lots of different other things at play. And also they don't have voting patterns like many white settler Australians do, that the whole family intergenerationally votes for the same party. So there are points of difference and there are points of similarity. And ethnicity comes into play when the community has been slighted in a particular way. So we know a little bit, but we don't know enough. And I think so this is an opportunity to create that evidence base, as you said, Tharini, but also speak back to some of those mainstream media narratives about which cast migrant communities with the same brush, or which assume that their ethnicity is the only kind of deciding factor in how they vote, and not their, not the time of migration, or not where they live, or not their, level of education, or what occupation their parents come from. So that whole kind of, identity axis seems to not come into play when you're a migrant. Somehow your ethnicity trumps everything else. So we need to find an evidence base of, speaking of migrants as though they're agents of their own life. While it is important to have the misinformation and disinformation narrative in mind in terms of migrants' media engagement, it's also really important that after the survey, we're going to do in-depth focus groups to enable migrants the agency to self-represent, to really talk about how they're engaging and give them an opportunity to talk to the political issues that matter to them. So we can't always assume that all migrants are vulnerable to mis or disinformation without, giving them the opportunity to also sort of talk to the issues that they do care about, and subsequently providing platforms which do give them, engagement with, say, Indigenous history, or with contemporary Australian politics, or even, just a basic level of media literacy. So I do think that this is sort of the very first step. It's the foundation for many more interventions to come. But we do need to begin with this particular piece of work so that, we can design interventions that actually are suited to the communities, instead of having top-down initiatives that they don't care about, and that are not tailored for them.
Thank you. And Fan, would you like to add to the research rationale and significance at your end?
Yeah, totally. I agree with what Sukhmani just said, and also it's very important to for migrant communities, and also I'd like to emphasize that migrant communities are really diverse and they're very hegemonic. And we've also seen, during the election, Chinese language media, they organize their own polls. Instead of looking at the public polls that are organized by, for example, Australian English media or national media, they organize their own version of polls, because it's a very dynamic community, and it's really hard to predict what they're going through, and it is really hard to predict their public sentiment as well. And on the one hand, it's very important for migrant communities to understand or to highlight the significance of political participation and also media literacy. On the other hand, we think that it's very important for Australian public institutions to understand what's going on within not just Chinese migrant communities, but also South Asian communities as well. Because what we have been seeing is that politicians and also Australian public institutions, they consider migrant communities, during elections, they use migrant communities and their media in a very instrumental way. They engage with them, but not in a genuinely way. Like, they just take those social media platforms like a very convenient tool, which eliminate the barrier to, broadcast their information on Australian national media. It's a really cheap and convenient tool for them. But after the election, no communication at all, right? So we think that,
yeah,
Yeah, it's just really important for
Mm.
Australian public institutions to understand information consumption patterns of migrant communities and not just, teach them how to vote, but tell them or, use a more accessible way to keep migrant communities informed about information that not that English communities, take for granted, right? So it's just why migrant communities are not on the same page with those people on Twitter,
Yeah.
right? We deserve access to public institutions. We deserve or access to Australian politicians as well, but why we're not now? So I guess that once again highlight the significance of this research, not just for migrant communities, Chinese migrants, South Asian migrants, but also for Australian public institutions and media outlets as well.
Yeah, and I remember I used to have a neighbor, and they're migrants from Sri Lanka, and I kid you not, they'd have the TV on 24 hours almost, and they would watch cable TV to watch programs from back home. So they weren't actually watching your Australian news or programs. So how do you reach those people, and that too in a very consistent manner, not only just during election time, but outside of that as well? How do you reach them? And again, like the Chinese community, very active in on WeChat, and the other website you mentioned, I can't pronounce it. You said
Red.
Yeah. So there's another website. It's completely in Mandarin, and that's something else that they use. So they're not using your mainstream, your Facebook, Instagrams, to access information. I think the consistency of engaging with those communities need to be there, but we need more information on that, which is why this piece of research is so important. And as allies in color, I've been extremely frustrated by the way that especially migrant communities, especially during election time, the way in which they're spoken about by so-called political pundits. And to be fair, we don't have a lot of diversity in our media sphere. So a lot of the political analysts, they're not they're not multicultural or ethnic. So when they do speak about analyze the voting patterns or attitudes, they don't do it from a very informed manner. There's a lot of inference and assumptions being made. So I've been extremely frustrated by that, and I think which is why I'm working with the both of you to do this important piece of research. So jumping to the research itself, we've got two versions. We've got the English version and we've got the Mandarin version. I'll put the links up below the video for all of you to access. We'd appreciate it if you're from the South Asian background or the Chinese background, or even if you're mixed, we'd encourage you to do this survey.